The human mating system is not like any other animals, but that does not mean that it escapes the laws governing mating systems, which have been documented in hundreds of species. Any gene predisposing a male to be cuckolded or a female to receive less paternal help than her neighbors would quickly be tossed from the gene pool. Any gene that allowed a male to impregnate all the females or a female to bear the most indulged offspring of the best male would quickly take over. These selection pressures are not small. For human sexuality to be socially constructed and independent of biology, as the popular academic view has it, not only must it have miraculously escaped these powerful pressures, but it must have withstood equally powerful pressures of a different kind. If a person played out a socially constructed role, other people could shape the role to prosper at his or her expense. Powerful men, indeed, could brainwash the others in order to enjoy being celibate or cuckolded, leaving the women for them. Any willingness to accept socially constructed gender roles would be selected out, and genes for restricting the roles would take over. What kind of animal is Homo sapiens? We are mammals, indeed primates, so a woman's minimum parental investment is much larger than that of a man's. She contributes 9 months to pregnancy, and in a natural environment, 2 to 4 years of nursing. He contributes a few minutes of sex and a teaspoon of semen. And so, basically, men are about 1.15 times as large as women, which tells us that they have competed in our evolutionary history with some men mating with several women and some men mating with none. Unlike gibbons, who were isolated, monogamous, and relatively sexless, and gorillas, who are clustered, harem-forming, and relatively sexless, we are gregarious, with men and women living together in large groups and constantly facing opportunities to couple. Men have smaller testicles for their body size than chimps, but bigger ones than gorillas and gibbons, suggesting that the ancestral women were not wantonly promiscuous, but were not always monogamous either. Children are born helpless and remain dependent on adults for an extreme large chunk of the human lifespan, presumably because knowledge and skills are so pertinent to the human way of life. And so children need parental investment, and men because they get meat from hunting and other resources. And this has something to do with investment. Men far exceed the minimum investment that their anatomy would let them get away with. They feed, they protect, and teach their children. That should make cuckoldry a concern to men, and a man's willingness and ability to invest in children a concern to women. And because men and women live together in large groups, like chimps, but the males invest in their offspring, like birds, we developed marriage, in which a man and a woman form a reproductive alliance that is meant to limit demands from third parties for sexual access and parental investment. These facts of life, of course, have never changed, but others have. And until very recently, men hunted and women gathered. Women were married soon after puberty. There was no contraception, no institutionalized adoption by non-relatives, and no artificial insemination. Sex, of course, meant reproduction, and vice versa. There was no food from domesticated plants or animals, and so there was no baby formula. And so all children were breastfed. There was also no paid daycare, and no house husbands. Babies and toddlers hung around with their mothers and other women in order for the nursing to occur. And these conditions persisted throughout 99% of our evolutionary history and have shaped our sexuality as well. Our sexual thoughts and feelings are adapted to a world in which sex leads to babies, whether or not we want to make babies now or not. And of course, considering the majority of the humans on our earth have hardly had about half the total lifespan that which we have now. And they are adapted, of course, to a world in which children were a mother's problem more than a father's problem. And when I use terms like should, best, or optimal, they will be a shorthand for the strategies that would have led to reproductive success in that world. I will not, however, be referring to what is morally right, attainable in the modern world, or conducive to happiness, which are different matters altogether. And so the first question of strategy is how many partners to want. Remember that when the minimum investment in offspring is greater for females, a male can have more offspring if he mates with many females. But a female, however, does not have more offspring if she mates with many males. One per conception is enough. And suppose a foraging man with one wife can expect 2 to 5 children with her. A premarital or extramarital liaison that conceives a child would increase his reproductive output by 20 to 50%. Of course, if the child starves or is killed because the father is not around, then the father is genetically no better off. And so the optimal liaison then is with a married woman whose husband would bring up the child. But in foraging societies, fertile women were almost or are almost always married. No sex with a woman is usually sex with a married woman. And even if she is not, more fatherless children live than die. So a liaison with an unmarried partner can increase reproduction as well. And so none of this mathematics applies to women. A part of the male mind then should want a variety of sexual partners for the sheer sake of having a variety of sexual partners. But do you think that the only difference between men and women is that men like women and women like men? Any bartender or grandmother that you would ask would say that men are more likely to have a wandering eye. But of course, perhaps that is just an old-fashioned stereotype. However, the psychologist David Buss has looked for the stereotype in the people that are most likely to refute it. Men and women in elite liberal American universities, generation after the feminist revolution, in the heyday of politically correct sensibilities. The methods are refreshingly direct, and confidential questionnaires asked a series of questions. How strongly are you seeking a spouse? The answers were, on average, identical for men and women alike. How strongly are you seeking a one-night stand? The women said, not very strongly. The men said, pretty strongly. Of course, how many sexual partners would you like to have in the next month, in the next 2 years, in your entire lifetime? Women said that in the next month, 8/10 of a sexual partner would be just about right. They wanted 1 in the next 2 years and 4 or 5 over their lifetimes. But men wanted 2 sex partners within the month. 8 in the next 2 years and 18 over their lifetimes. Of course, would you consider having sex with a desirable partner that you had known for 5 years, for 2 years, for a month, for a week? And women said probably yes. For a man they had known for a year or more, neutral for one that they had known for 6 months, and definitely not for someone they had known for a week or less. Men said probably yes, as long as they had known the woman for a week. And how short a time would a man have to know a woman before he would definitely not have sex with her? But Buss never found out. His scale did not go down past 1 hour. When Buss presented these findings at a university and explained them in terms of a parental investment and sexual selection, a young woman raised her hand and said, Professor Buss, I have a simpler explanation of your data. And yes, of course, you said, what is that? And he said, men are slime. Men aren't really slime, or are they just trying to look like slime? And perhaps in questionnaires, men try to exaggerate their studiliness, but women want to avoid looking easy. And of course, the psychologists R.D. Clark and Elaine Hatfield hired attractive men and women to approach strangers of the opposite sex on a college campus and say to them, I have been noticing you around campus. I find you extremely attractive. And then ask one of the 3 questions. 1, would you go out with me tonight? 2, would you come over to my apartment tonight? 3, would you go to bed with me tonight? And half the women consented to a date. Half the men consented to a date. 6% of the women consented to go to the Stooges' apartment. 69% of the men consented to go to the Stooges' apartment. And of course, none of the women consented to sex, but 75% of the men consented to sex. Of course, because there's not much at stake if the men get someone pregnant. It's a lot at stake if the woman does. But however, of the remaining 25%, many were apologetic, asking for a rain check or explaining that they couldn't because their fiance was in town. Of course, the results have been replicated in several states. And when the studies were concluded, after they were conducted, contraception was widely available and safe-sex practices were heavily publicized. So the results cannot be dismissed simply because women might be more cautious about pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases. Of course, an awakening of male sexual desire and drive by a new partner is known as the Coolidge effect, after a famous anecdote. One day, President Calvin Coolidge and his wife were visiting a government farm and were taken on separate tours. But when Mrs. Coolidge was shown the chicken pens, she asked whether the rooster copulated more than once a day. Dozens of times, replied the guide. Please tell that to the president, Mrs. Coolidge requested. When the president was shown the pens and told about the rooster, he asked, same hen every time? And he said, oh no, Mr. President, a different one each time. The president said, tell that to Mrs. Coolidge. And many male mammals are indefatigable when a new willing female is available after each copulation. They cannot be fooled by the experimenter cloaking a previous partner or masking her scent. And this shows incidentally that male sexual desire and drive is not exactly undiscriminating. Of course, males may not care what kind of female they mate with, but they are hypersensitive to which female they mate with. It is another example of a logical distinction between individuals and categories that I have argued was so pertinent when criticizing associationism. Men do not have the sexual stamina of roosters, but they do show a kind of Coolidge effect in their desire over long periods. And in many cultures, including our own, men report that their sexual ardor for their wives wanes in the first year of marriage. It is in the concept of the individual person, of course not in her appearance or other qualities, that triggers the decline. The taste for new partners after a couple of years is not just an example of variety being the spice of life, as in getting bored with strawberry and wanting to try chocolate. But in Isaac Singer's story, Schlemiel I, a simpleton from the mythical village of Chelm, sets out on a trip but loses his way and inadvertently returns home, thinking he has come across another village, but which by an amazing coincidence looks just like his. He meets a woman who looks exactly like his wife that he has grown tired of and finds her ravishing. Another part of the male sexual mind and drive is an ability to be easily aroused by a possible sex partner, indeed by the faintest hint of a possible sex partner. Zoologists, for example, have found that the males of many species will count an enormous range of objects having a vague resemblance to the female. Other females of the wrong species, females of the right species that have been stuffed and nailed to a board, parts of stuffed females, such as a head suspended in midair, even parts of stuffed females with important features missing like the eyes and the mouth. The male of the human species is aroused by the sight of a nude woman, not only in the flesh but in the movies, photographs, drawings, postcards, dolls, and of course, bitmapped cathode ray tube displays. He takes pleasure in the mistaken identity, supporting a worldwide pornography industry, which in the United States alone grosses $10 billion a year, almost as much as spectator sports and the movies combined. In foraging cultures, young men make charcoal drawings and scratch them in the sand. Pornography, of course, is similar in the world over and was much the same a century ago as it is today. Of course, it depicts in graphic physical detail a succession of anonymous nude females eager for casual, impersonal sex. And it would make no sense for a woman to be easily aroused by the sight of a nude male. A fertile woman never has a shortage of willing sexual partners, and of course in that buyer's market she can seek the best husband available, the best genes, or other returns on her sexual favors. If she could be aroused by the sight of a naked man, men could induce her to have sex by exposing themselves, and her bargaining position would be compromised. Of course, the reactions of the sexes to nudity are quite different. Men see nude women as a kind of invitation. Women see nude men as a kind of threat. In 1992, a Berkeley student known around campus as the Naked Guy chose to jog, attend class, and eat in the dining halls in the nude as a protest against the repressive sexual traditions of Western society. Of course, he was expelled when some female students protested that his behavior should be classified as sexual harassment. Of course, it wasn't necessarily. They may have thought it was sexual harassment, and probably, regardless, was indecent exposure. And of course, women do not seek the sight of naked male strangers or enactments of anonymous sex, and there's virtually no female market for pornography. Playgirl, for example, the supposed counterexample, is clearly for gay men, but it has no ads for any product that a woman may buy, and when a woman gets a subscription as a gag gift, she finds herself on mailing lists for gay male pornography and sex toys. Of course, in the laboratory, though, some early experiments claimed that men and women showed identical physiological arousal to a pornographic passage. Of course, women might have high sex drives as well. Of course, that's not as large as men. And the men, however, showed a bigger response to the neutral passage in the control condition than the women who showed the pornography. Of course, the so-called neutral passage, which has been chosen by the female investigators, described a man and a woman chatting about the relative merits of an anthropology major over pre-med. Of course, the men found it highly erotic, and women can sometimes be aroused when they have agreed to watch portrayals of intercourse, but they do not, however, seek them out. As some psychologists have pointed out that women are more choosy than men in consenting to sex, but once they have consented, there is no reason to believe that they are any less responsive to sexual stimulation. Of course, the closest mass market equivalents to pornography for women are the romance novel. And for example, when the sex is described in the context of emotions and relationships rather than as a succession of bumping bodies. The desire for sexual variety is an unusual adaptation, for it is insatiable. Most commodities of fitness show diminishing returns for an optimal level. People do not seek mass quantities of air, food, and water, and they want to be not too hot and not too cold, but just right. But the more women a man has sex with, the more offspring he leaves. Too much is never enough, however, and that gives men a limitless appetite for casual sex partners, and perhaps for the commodities that in ancestral environments would have led to multiple partners, such as power and wealth. Of course, everyday life offers most men few opportunities to plumb the bottom of the desire, but occasionally a man is rich, famous, handsome, and amoral enough to try.